we're not doing this just because of the medical stuff, and I think that's right. I don't think recreational quite is fair. So I think I agree with the companies to some extent on that. So what does this mean, and why do we care, and why do I think that this matters? And what are the choices in front of us in terms of thinking about how this technology is going to work out? So here we are, it's 2008, 2009, and we've got incredible technologies. I'll describe just the sequencing stuff in just a minute. And we have radically different frameworks for genetic testing that exist on our planet simultaneously. You've got pure consumer, direct to consumer, you buy it and you get it. And we've got highly medicalized genetic testing under the Huntington's disease framework. Which way are we going to go? How are we going to get there? Let's think about what happens if we keep it under the medical model. We're comfortable with that because we're used to it, and we're pretty sure that it's going to be safe. If this knowledge is toxic, we're going to have some control over that. We're going to make sure that bad things don't happen to people. Or we're not going to be able to be sure of it, but we're going to certainly reduce the risks of that, and we're going to regulate it. We're going to make sure that when you go to get a result, you know that the result is valid, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all sorts of things we can do under the medical model to keep tight control over the technology. But that model has some other consequences. One is it's really expensive. Why? Not because of the technology itself, but because the technology is coupled to the people who deliver it. Doctors are expensive. And doctors plus genetic counselors are even more expensive, although not a whole lot more expensive. But the thing is, we're never going to get off that trajectory. You can't take, it doesn't matter how cheap the genetic testing gets, you're always going to be paying for the labor, and it's never going to get any cheaper. In fact, it always gets more expensive. People always get more expensive, except in times like right now, which we don't want to go through, right? So huge transaction costs because you have to have your health professional involved in handling all this information, heavily regulated, and very few companies take all the time and trouble to develop these products. So you've got a very constricted number of players in the market. That's what happens if we treat this as a pure medical model. Now, pushing against that, this is a diagram of what's been happening to the underlying core technology. This is raw cost of deriving an entire human genomic sequence. So when Wally Gilbert stood in front of the bulletin board, or the blackboard at Cold Spring Harbor in June of 1986, explaining what the Human Genome Project was, what the basic idea was, he wrote down this very famous figure of, it's about $1 a base pair, and there are 3 billion base pairs in the human genome, so it's going to cost about $3 billion. And that was kind of the extent of the calculation. It was a pretty good guess. That was what the projected cost was in 1985 to do a reference genome, although it was technically absolutely impossible to do it. It's what they thought it would be costing if they could actually do it. In fact, by the time it was actually done in 2000, 2001, Celera probably spent something on the order of 300 million to 500 million to do the genomes that it created in its human reference genome. And the Human Genome Project was less efficient because it was more distributed, and after all, it was government. So it costs probably something on the order of $1 billion to create the reference genomes under the Human Genome Project. By 2007, that picture that I showed you of Jim Watson getting his genome, it probably cost, that set of experiments to get Jim Watson's genome probably cost something on the order of $3 to $5 million. And of course, I showed you the figure from KNOME, K-N-O-M-E, KNOME. They said $350,000 will give you your genome. If you do it at a government lab, or if you, there are now Yoruba genomes on the internet, and a Chinese genomics researcher has his genome on the internet now. And those probably cost something on the order of $1 million to create. There's a company that has said by the end of this calendar year they will do an entire genome for $5,000, and they're accepting contracts to produce the data to do a genome for $5,000. And there are grants being granted by government agencies all over the world to create a $100 genome. And this is not crazy to think that it might actually work. I won't go into the technologies, but there are some unbelievable technologies that are being applied to the question of how do you derive DNA sequencing. So it does seem, now if you think about it, now you know what happened in computing. The whole story of personal computing was in part a technological story of chips getting smaller, better, faster, and cheaper. And what did that do? It meant that people who thought about the very famous statement from Watson, the head of IBM, is there's a total market for 5 computers in the whole world. Why did he say that? Well, because there was only one census bureau. There were only a few places that were ever going to need that kind of computing power. Well, he was kind of wrong, right? This is what happens when a technology moves on what's called Moore's curve. Gordon Moore was one of the co-founders of Intel. And he did this famous curve of showing that the power of computing chips was doubling every 18 months. And if you do that over and over and over again, you have miraculous effects on what people do with the technology. You find new things you're going to use that technology to do. That's where we are, but this is actually kind of a hyper-Moore's curve. If you look at it, this is 3 times 10 to the 9th down to 10 to the squared. So that's a factor of 10 million-fold reduction in the cost of sequencing over a period of 15 years. Quite an extraordinary thing. And so where are we in that curve? We are very, very close to the beginning of it. Or the sequencing cost has not dropped down. So I'm now going to only talk about 2 things. One is, how are we going to approach this from a policy perspective? One thing that we can do is adopt the medical model, which keeps it expensive, and not very much of this will happen because it'll be expensive not because of the technology, it'll be expensive because of the people associated with the technology, the medical people. The other possibility is the world won't let us do it that way. And that's what I'm predicting is actually going to happen. The world will not let it be that way. So 23andMe is saying, don't you stand between me and my genome. That's kind of the ideology. And probably that's going to capture enough of the truth that it's going to drive policy. So why are they saying that? Well, one thing that happens when you have lots of people doing lots of stuff is exactly what happened with computers. We use them now for communication, for doing presentations. Why? Because it's an incredibly powerful communication tool, and there are incredibly powerful network effects when you have people sharing information. Because I can use your data, you can use my data. Information accrues very powerfully. We can share documents, we can share calendars, we can do all sorts of stuff that we could not do before because we're sharing data. And that stuff simply doesn't happen. That's a network effect. And the more people that are on the network, the more valuable the network effects are. It's an incredibly powerful thing. So if you think, if any of us, when I was growing up, would think that something that's created by volunteer users would be a better and more available encyclopedia than the Encyclopedia Britannica, people would have thought we were insane. But it turns out that that's true. And in fact, how do we know that? Because it happened. Not because anybody planned it, but because it happened. Moreover, nobody had to plan it. There are zero planning costs associated with many of the network effects. You don't have to coordinate it from the center. You just let it happen. Second thing is, we do have a tendency to be worried about the things that we know can go wrong. And we focus on those things that we know can go wrong without thinking about the benefits of letting it happen. So the example that I'm going to give here is what was the debate that was going on in the US Congress at the time that the internet was being born. Lo and behold, what's the first and most lucrative use of the internet for a communication tool? It's for guys to sit in a room because you can privately download stuff and nobody will know you're doing it. So what do?